So my name is Thomas Schmidt, and I'm a ceramic artist primarily, but I'm working in a lot of different 3D media. I'm also an educator, so I teach 3D interdisciplinary studies at UNC Charlotte. And this exhibition is a collection of work that I've been working on since as early as 2006, I think is the first piece in the show, all the way until work that was made this year, 2026. So it's kind of a nice range, and been a really great opportunity to exhibit works that have never really been shown together before. The title of the show is Encoded Surface, and I was thinking a lot about the surface as a site for meaning and content. You know, we sometimes associate the surface as being superficial, and it's not, maybe it doesn't have substance or depth, but in fact I think the surface carries so much content, and so I think that's one thing that sort of ties a lot of the work together. So the term post-digital refers to the condition where we as a society are so dependent on digital technology that it's sort of intertwined with our daily life. It's actually not even something that we necessarily even think about all the time because it's so ubiquitous. And I would say that we're in a period now where digital tools are also becoming so intertwined with different processes in the craft world that perhaps we need to consider, you know, what that means for our approach to materiality, to touch, to tactility. I think we're at a point now where it's a bit of an identity crisis for craft media, including ceramics, because traditionally ceramics really was all about touch and the handmade, but it's sort of entering a phase where we might need to consider, like, how do 3D printers and how does, you know, virtual reality and all these things actually tie into our notion of craft. Yeah, that is something that does tie all of this work together, is kind of an obsession with the process, and I suppose that is really a big part of this overarching term of craft, is that it's this engagement with material that is often complicated, lots of room for error, a lot of trial and error. People often will use the phrase thinking through making, and I think that's a really great way to consider craft or process-heavy media. In this work in particular, I guess because I'm looking at the Recycled China triptych, I'll start there. This was a piece that I produced with my friend Jeffrey Stephen Miller. He's an artist that's now based in Providence, Rhode Island. But we started collaborating when we both lived in Beijing, China. I had the opportunity to teach there right after grad school, and it was just totally life-changing experience. And we acquired all of this ceramics that was discarded from factories, not really sure how to use it, but we just knew, like, there was this opportunity there. So we got about 500 plates initially from a factory in Jingdezhen. They were just happy to get rid of them. We had them sent to Beijing and did all kinds of experiments, and ultimately we crushed them with a steamroller. It was really fun and dramatic. And then we used the aggregate for other experiments, a whole bunch of different things. And we finally tested pouring aluminum over the shards, and the molten metal like flowed and curled around the shards, and as it cooled it kind of locked all the chunks of porcelain in place. And once we kind of let it cool down and remove this little sample, we were both blown away by the result. It was just this really beautiful collision of materials and had just enough blinginess to it to like catch your eye, and we knew we were onto something. So that was an example of like just trial and error, you know, conducting experiments, and then once you see something that clicks, that ideally will open up a bunch of new questions. Maybe another one that's worth talking about would be the 3D printed pieces. So the process here is really so different because the ideation is all happening behind a screen, and once one has enough experience with 3D modeling, it does become a kind of sketchbook. So it's not maybe as kind of cold and sterile as some people think. Like, you're actually kind of improvising, and kind of drawing lines, extruding things digitally. So there's a lot of play still in that world. And for me, this kind of play was all about studies in form, and I'm beginning with simple two-dimensional lines and then extruding lines, twisting them, distorting them, and after printing some pieces, you begin to see the results, and it's not necessarily what you saw on the screen. So then there's this chance to kind of respond once again. So there's this dialogue between the digital space and then the analog space and back again. And that's where the craft kind of comes back in, is like responding to what you see, remixing it, augmenting it some more, and playing with the distortion, the imperfections that happen in the printing process. So although I think there's a misconception that 3D printing is just hitting print and you're done, it's actually couldn't be further from the truth. There's a lot of trial and error that happens, and I'm actually quite interested in the glitch, the potential for imperfection, and I think that's where this kind of work might be going. So the analog and digital experience has really become such an important consideration today, and I think it's because the screen-based experience is inextricably linked to everything we do. And so I'm trying to think about how I can take some of those digital experiences and have them embedded in the work, but maybe kind of blurring those aspects in with the handmade, in with the kind of analog experience. So maybe, like in the Notebook series, it's a 3D model that's been translated as a digital decal and then applied to the ceramics, fired, and then there's maybe some hand-drawn drops of glaze or scribbles on top of the digital image. So it's kind of like putting layers of analog and digital to the point where you don't know which is which anymore. So I'm kind of curious about like that weird unknown, it's like a little bit of this augmented reality as well, where perhaps, who knows whether or not this will truly catch on, but if someone is kind of viewing the world through a screen and beginning to see overlays of other information, at what point is, the real world in front of us? At what point is it something projected? Thinking about product design and design in general, I think that also involves a different kind of mindset, because there's a lot of ideation, there's a lot of prototyping, and a lot of the creative process actually happens away from the physical material. And I think one of the ways I was able to kind of give myself permission to work digitally is thinking of this more as a designer, kind of taking off the artist hat and thinking of it more as a design challenge. And in that way, I think the act of drawing, the act of 3D modeling, prototyping is so critical in kind of thinking and developing an idea. So I think if we kind of reframe the way we approach making, it doesn't all have to be about your hands in the clay. I think there's so many other important parts of the process that are equally important. Maybe there's parts of an artist's process where it's all about like walking, through the forest, or there's these moments that are about inspiration and kind of taking in stimuli. I think that's maybe equally important to the physical making. I was, on my drive out here, I was just thinking about how these opportunities to do artist talks are really cool because it gives you a chance to kind of reflect a lot on your history and how the work came to be. And one thing that I feel is so crucial and often easily overlooked is just how many influences there are in one's own life. And every piece in here, I feel like I could look at it and name, people who were super influential to me, even on a personal level. So, I have to acknowledge a professor at Alfred, Wayne Higbee. He was the person who brought me to China the first time. I was working as his assistant for a big commissioned wall or hanging suspended tile piece that he did, and was just so formative in bringing me to China and kind of giving me the opportunity to work there for 4 years. So that's really huge. There was another artist that I assisted. Her name was Ruth Duckworth, and she's just an incredible artist and amazing person. And I had the opportunity to work for her for a few years. And I would say she was really influential when it comes to my sampled spaces work. It's these crumpled tile pieces. And when I was assisting her, a lot of the work I was helping her produce were these wall pieces where she was exploring light and shadow and form within this kind of relatively shallow relief of a few inches. And that couldn't help but influence my work at the time, and I continued to kind of find ways to translate that into my own repertoire and language of form and texture. So I still see her when I look at that work as well. Yeah, other influences. The color scheme of my 3D printed work is very much inspired by a friend, Seth Payne. He was exploring a lot of these terra sigillata surfaces in grad school, where you basically take natural clays and you sift them to the point where you're only getting the finest particles, and the surface is actually incredibly thin, so it's not really hiding much of the clay the way a glaze does. The glaze really coats it, it's like wearing a winter jacket on top of yourself. Terra sigillata, it might as well be spandex. It's like super thin, and it's showing off all the texture and surface of the original form. And Seth was doing all of these amazing explorations of color. My work at the time was very stark, like white or black. And in this body of work, I was unconsciously summoning Seth's work. I was like, all right, we're gonna bring some color back into this work. So it was really exciting to begin to explore color, and I had to give a nod to Seth. So there's a lot of those personal influences. There's a lot of art historical references too. I love artists like Oliver Eliasson, Sarah Zay, artists who are doing more installation work, Dohosa. I love these experiential pieces, but I don't know that it translates so directly. So for me, maybe it's just good to list some of those personal influences. It's different for every series, and I suppose when I see all the work in the show, because it's spanning pretty nice length of time, sometimes I feel like I'm really hopping around a lot. And I've had a colleague of mine, Eric Watercotty, reminded me, like, no, there is a thread that's connecting everything. For a while I was like, am I just all over the place? And he's like, no, it's there. But I think one thing I will say is it's important to keep yourself engaged and excited by what you're doing. And I would say that's really a key thread that ties this all together. Is, for me, it's the sense of discovery that drives everything. And once I feel like I've got a better understanding of that process or that visual phenomena that's happening, I might get this itch to try something new and hop over into something unfamiliar. so that's really a lot of why there are these kind of disparate series within this show. It's just different questions that I've had over the years. In the case of the sampled spaces, or the intervals pieces behind me, this was really the first series where I took some of the crumpled tiles that I have been making since grad school, but this time I introduced these metallic prints, so it's digital prints on aluminum, and I was thinking a lot about this idea of a musical interval, which is the kind of frequency between two notes, and it produces a chord. It's kind of fascinating to think about how every chord is just a combination of frequencies, and they might be dissonant, they might be harmonious, but there's just these two notes that can have profoundly different effects. So I was thinking about, what does that mean visually? Perhaps, maybe the work of like Joseph Albers, where there's these two colors, a small square on top of a big square. It's that simple, but it produces this vibration. In this case, I wanted to see what happens when I combine these kind of crumpled topographies with a kind of color spectrum and splice them together. And I'm still not sure what the answer is. I'm not sure what that result is. But I'm still captivated by that combination, and that's the important part, is that my head is still curious. So I think I'll keep exploring that work for sure. Yeah, it's interesting because I think with experimental work, there's the option to keep the work in that truly raw experimental phase, or there's the option to then kind of take that experiment and distill it into something that is more maybe cohesive or polished. And I would say I tend to gravitate towards the more polished. I do, for better or worse, I do kind of want the work to land maybe closer towards design in a way. And maybe that's a little bit about, trying to harness something uncontrollable. It's maybe a little bit about trying to bring precision into play. It's also maybe back to the musical analogies. I would say it's like instead of going into pure like sound art, it's a little bit closer to pop in some ways. Maybe not, but I think that there's something about the hook. There's something about the beauty that I see as being a kind of lure into the content of the work, and I want the work to have a certain seduction on the surface that brings you in closer. So in that way, I think that to me the experimentation is really the starting point, but then there's this degree of refinement and composition. A lot of the work is distilled into a grid or a cube or these more simple, minimal shapes and forms. I think of that as being a kind of measuring device. So by having these simplified forms, then all of the kind of chaos within them has something to kind of push up against. Maybe something like the recycled china pieces, if it was allowed to exist as a kind of puddle of molten metal with shards, it would have a very different feeling than when there's a hard kind of sliced edge. I think the edge to me is a really nice kind of counterbalance to the kind of chaos within the space. So I guess that's one way I think a little bit about that balance between chance and control. Maybe one piece that I could talk about for that is the data mine series. So Future Flora. So it's this tangled network of spheres, and this one I think is maybe the most reflection on that history of ceramics and ceramics as a kind of carrier of cultural narratives and tradition. So this was made right after I came back to the States from China, and kind of going back a little bit. So when I moved to China, it was really a teaching opportunity that came out of the blue. So I got dropped into this world and was just like totally awestruck for 4 straight years, thinking I knew a lot about ceramics, and then landing there, it was like the most humbling experience ever, because there's just this long, rich history, and different parts of the country have very different traditions and use of materials, from like these Zheshua earthenware teapots to the Qinghua blue and white porcelain in Jingdezhen. There's like all of these deep, rich histories. And then also within China and really around the world, there is this kind of collision of these traditional ways of working with new technology. And I was really fascinated by that friction and energy that was happening while I was living in China between industry and tradition. So that piece is this kind of abstract reflection on this crazy, messy, complicated collision of different forces in the ceramics world. So most of the piece is made from originally like 3D printed models of spheres that I made molds of and cast while at a residency in Jingdezhen. The surface decoration is kind of a remix of the blue and white traditional patterns, floral patterns in Chinese ceramics, but in this case, they're really skewed pictures of moss and lichen that I took in the forests of Jingdezhen. So they're not meant to really be beautiful anymore. They're kind of growing out of control across the piece. And then on the tips of some of these little branches are these found objects that include industrial ceramics, 3D printed parts, kiln scrap from an ancient kiln site in China, an old broken tea spout from another kiln site in China, and just a whole variety of objects that kind of represent different points in history. So the piece is meant to be this messy tangle of all of these different aspects of the medium, and there's no real answer. It's just putting it all out there, and it's allowed to be messy. It's kind of, in a way, it's kind of celebrating the messiness of our current state of craft and art and design. It's not meant, I think, to really be clearly defined in these little boxes. I think it's kind of fun to embrace, the indefinable aspects of it. So the project with Jeffrey is something that I would say it's maybe on pause for a minute, but I think we both really want to revisit this collaboration. He went to graduate school in London at Central St. Martin's and actually continued to do a lot of exciting work that's related to this work, including one project that got a lot of press was he was vacuuming up all of the iron dust of the tube, the subways in London, and using that to make glazed surfaces for his tiles. So he was taking and then the clay was also from the tunnels that were bored to produce new tunnels in London. So all of this body of work was all about reconstituting waste in a way, and the kind of byproducts of the subway system. So he's definitely kept that thread going, and I've been exploring this in a way as well. I've been using some recycled decals in some of the notebook series. I'm using local clays to produce some of the surfaces in the 3D printed work. So I think we both are continuing to think about aspects of reuse, sustainability, and I'm really curious to see how we can kind of come back together now after kind of going off in our own paths for a little bit and revisit this within the States instead of China. So yeah, stay tuned. I'm sure we're going to come up with something. I really want viewers to kind of experience the reward of looking closely. I think the work has a certain experience from a distance, but I think as you get up close, there's a whole other experience. And whether it's kind of coming up really close and seeing the floral decoration in the recycled china triptych, or looking on the inside of the 3D printed pots, or finding the little glazes that I've hole punched for the notebook series. There's Chinese decals where I just hole punched and put a little piece of a flower in a few of them. There's these moments of surprise where it kind of rewards you for looking closely. I want the viewer to kind of slow down and take that in. And you know, it's a real world experience that's, you know, away from our screens, and I think hopefully it's sort of reinvigorating that sort of sensory experience that I think many of us are longing for. I'm so grateful for organizations like the Arts Council and the Dalton Gallery, because it's such a wonderful opportunity to show in a big space with professional lighting, where you get to kind of revisit your own work. I've had some of these pieces shown in my studio. I've had some at various exhibitions around the country and internationally, but what a gift to put it all together in one big show close to home, where I can invite students and friends to kind of experience it. So it's a really great opportunity as an artist to have a venue like this to really put your work out there and connect with the community. So I'm very grateful. The first thing that comes to mind is I recently was landed the commission to produce a public artwork for Uptown Charlotte. So this will be next to the new museum in Uptown and the McGlowan Theater. And it's a couple years down the road, but I'm currently in the process of developing ideas and going to organize an opportunity to do some work with the community to help generate some ideas for this piece. So it's a huge opportunity, definitely probably the most visible work in my career so far. So there's a lot riding on it, but I'm not nervous. I'm just getting really charged about it. My Instagram is @ThomasSchmidtStudio, and check the description for the spelling of my name. And then my website is thomasschmidt.org.